Lillahi ta'ala, barakallahu fikum. Let's get started here. Moving right along in the explanation of Al-Bayquniyah, the Bayquni poem in Mustalah Hadith terminology. Now, had I asked you, what's the name of this science we are involved in? You should say Mustalah. So you know that name, right? Anyone here did not know that name? Mustalah. Mustalah. Mustalah means terminology. Every science has mustalah. But the hadith science is called mustalah. Al-mustalah. When they say fi ilm al-mustalah, in the science of mustalah, they mean hadith terminology in particular. But every science has mustalah. Hmm. Now let's continue with the next line. Moving right along, insha'Allah ta'ala, marching towards Alfiyah bi'ithnillahi ta'ala. So the author says, here's the next line before I read the explanation for you. وَكُلُّ مَا قَلَّتْ رِجَالُهُ عَلَى وَضِدُّهُ ذَاكَ الَّذِي قَدْ نَزَلَ وَكُلُّ مَا قَلَّتْ رِجَالُهُ عَلَى وَضِدُّهُ ذَاكَ الَّذِي قَدْ نَزَلَ. This means all of what its men were few is high, and its opposite, that is the one that descended. Or let me try another translation for you. Here. Wakullu, all or any of what? Ma, what? Qallat, few. That's a verb though. Qallat, past tense verb. To be few or was few. Rijaluhu, its men. Yani, were few. All of what its men were few. Ala, ascended. Ascended. All of what its men were few ascended, went up. What does that mean? Means any hadith that its chain of narration is shorter than another one. Because we say shorter means you are comparing it. There's comparison here. So if there's comparison, there needs to be two. All of what its men were few ascended, or really here, qallat means fewer, fewer for the meaning of the comparison. And all of what, or any of what, its men were fewer, ascended. Yani, that narration ascended. وَضِدُّهُ, and its opposite, meaning all of what its men were more. That is the one that قد نزل, descended. Any of what its men were fewer, ascended. And its opposite, that is the one that descended. So that's just bare translation of the line. Before I read for you the explanation, know that ascended here does not mean better. Ascended does not mean better. And therefore, descended does not mean worse. Yani, we are not saying that if a hadith has a shorter chain of narration than another one, then that's better. No. Because ultimately, what makes the hadith better than the other? Who knows? Ultimately, what makes the one hadith better than another one? Does anyone know? 5, 4, 3, Precision? It's not what I'm looking for here. You're close though. Two, one. What I'm looking for is what? Sahah. Authenticity. Yes, for it to be authentic. The more authentic, the better. So when we say here, any hadith with fewer men is higher, higher here does not mean better. Rather, that's just a technical term. Yep. And therefore, for the hadith that has to have more men does not make it worse. And descended does not mean worse. Okay. So if a hadith has more men in the chain, but is more authentic, then that's better. If a hadith has fewer men in the chain, but is less authentic, it's not better. Uh, Also, I want to take the opportunity to talk about this verb here with you for a moment. The verb ala. Here's a digression. The verb is ala. That's past tense. Ala. That means he ascended. And the present or future tense is ya'lu, which means he ascends or will ascend. Ascends, present, or will ascend, that's future. Ala ya'lu. Uh, this verb ala is different from this particle here that you might know. Ala, pronounce them the same. You write them differently though. The verb has a tall alif, ala, and the particle, which means on or over, has an alif written like a ya. Ala. Uh, this word, the verb here, ala, this is what I really want to focus on with you here for a few minutes. This verb also can have the meaning of dominated, ascendancy with the meaning of dominance. And Mujahid, the student of Ibn Abbas, he explained the ayah. Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arsh istawa. He said, sorry, this is one that was so short there. He said, istawa. Mujahid, the student of Ibn Abbas, said, istawa means ala, the verb. Ala. So then he's saying, Mujahid is saying, the verse of the Quran means Ar-Rahman, that's Allah. Ala, ala al-arsh. Ala, ala al-arsh. Here, ala, ala. Here, ala means dominated. Ala, over. Ala, ala, dominated over the arsh. And let me give you one ayah from the Quran here, then we'll get back to our point. Allah says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وَمَا كَانَ مَعَهُ مِنْ إِلَهٍ. There was never a God with him. إِذًا لَذَهَبَ كُلُّ إِلَهٍ لذهب كل إله بما خلق ولعلى ولعلى بعضهم على بعض وما كان معه من إله. There was never a God with him. إذن, had there been, لذهب كل إله بما خلق, then every God would have taken what it created. وَلَعَلَى بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ, and then some of them would have dominated over others. عَلَى عَلَى وَلَعَلَى بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ. That's like the belief of Greeks. Didn't they say there's the God of the gods, and then there's other gods, each one has his own realm, and then they fight each other and defeat each other and punish each other like that. That fits here. Trinity fits there too, because they said there's Father, there's Son. So which one has merit over the other between a father and a son? A father. So that fits there. So let's go back. Now, here's the explanation for the line of poetry. The explainer, Sheikh Al-Jabarti, rahimahullah tabaraka wa ta'ala, says, وَكُلُّ مَا أي سند قلت رجاله أي قل عددهم على أي ارتفع أي يسمى عاليا. He said, Yani, he's explaining the line of poetry by breaking its words apart and inserting the explanation in between. The explanation is woven into the text itself. All of what or anything that a sanadin, any chain, meaning any chain that qallat rijaluhu, its men are fewer. Ay qalla adaduhum, meaning the number of the men. And remember, tell me please, this should be easy answer. What does men mean here? What does the word men, rijal, mean here? 5, 4, 3. Narrators, correct. Rijal is only a technical term, men, because this includes women. Women can be narrators also, like Aisha, rahimahullah, who was a great scholar. She was a great hadith scholar, and others too. So that's just a technical term. The narrators can be males or females, free or slave. Males or females, free or slave. So we would take from the slave. Slave could become a scholar. That's how the Muslims do. As for the kafir, he's going to make the slave ignorant on purpose. He's going to leave him ignorant. The Muslim's going to make him a scholar. Like Ibn Abbas, he used to put the shackle on the foot of Ikrimah and teach him. And he became a great scholar. And then it was reported when Ibn Abbas's son sold Ikrimah. And then Ikrimah knew about it. He went to Ibn Abbas's son. He said, "You sold your father's knowledge for such and such?" So then he realized what he did. So he went back to break the sale. And then he set him free. So anyway, All of what its chain, any hadith that its chain. So وَكُلُّ مَا yani basically means any hadith that قَلَّتْ رِجَالُهُ, its men, excuse me, or any chain, any hadith or any chain rather. Any chain that its men, meaning its narrators, men or women, free or slave, قلت are fewer, قل عددهم, meaning their number is fewer, على ارتفع, meaning it has ascended. Again, just a technical term. A technical term to refer to the few numbers of narrators, not to superiority of the narration. It could be an inferior narration, but happens to have fewer numbers of narrators in the chain. أي يسمى عالية, meaning this type of hadith is called al or ali, high. So any chain that its men are fewer in number has ascended, meaning it's called a high narration. Yes, if the hadith is authentic and has fewer numbers in the chain, then that is better. If there are two authentic hadiths, so both of them are authentic. One has fewer numbers of narrators, one has more. Then fewer is better. But fewer is not better by itself. Authenticity is superior to the fewer numbers. وَقَسَّمُوهُ خَمْسَةَ أَقْسَامٍ. Sheikh Al-Jabarti says, they, meaning the scholars, divided this, the high narration, into 5 divisions. Again, high here means in comparison to another narration, which is going to be the low narration. So they divided it into 5 categories. So these are going to be 5 categories in which something has fewer numbers compared to another one. الأول العلو إلى النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. The first is highness to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What does highness to the Prophet mean? Means fewer numbers of narrators. وهو أفضلها, and this is the best type of high narration. Now we're just talking about the highness only, not the authenticity. The highness. So shortness or fewness of narrators. They regard this fewness of narrators in several cases, and the highest, yani the best case is when there's few narrators back to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sallam. In كان الحديث صحيحا, Sheikh Al-Jabarti told us, this is the best one if the hadith is authentic. للقرب منه, because of its closeness to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yes. Some scholars said no, rather the low narration is better because when it has more narrators, we have to do more research. And if we have to do more research, that means we have to do more work. And if we have to do more work, that means there's more reward. And if there is more reward, then it's better. So they said the low narration is better. This saying is weak. Rather, the higher narration is better when it's authentic, with the authenticity, not the numbers only. And they said it's not going to be better because it took more work to verify it. They said this way, to look at it that way, is like going to Jumu'ah the long way and then missing the prayer. Going to Jumu'ah the long way because you get more footsteps. And then more footsteps means more reward, but then you wound up missing the prayer. والثاني إلى إمام من أئمة الحديث المشهورين كالإمام الزهري ومالك. And the second type of high report is a report that has, yani, is when the highness is in reference to, or when the few numbers go back to a leading imam amongst the famous ones. One of the famous imams, when we say imam here, when we say imam in this context means, yani, big shot, the big shots. Doesn't mean imam of masjid. Imam here means the elite masters. So what if you had a hadith and someone else had a hadith? And your chain goes back to Imam Malik and his chain goes back to Imam Malik. But your chain has fewer narrators than his. Then you have the higher one. But if his is authentic, his is better. You do want the high narrations. Don't confuse this. You want the high narration. It is preferable in itself because it's easier to verify. You don't want something that's harder to verify. You want something easier to verify if you can. You want anything authentic, though. Anything authentic. That's different from a hadith denier. He doesn't care if it's authentic or not. Because you say to a hadith denier, you claim you don't want the hadiths because there are, according to you, contradictory hadiths. What about the authentic ones? He's going to say, I don't want those either. So, لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. والثالث العلو إلى كتاب من كتب الحديث كالصحيحين والسنن. The third is the highness, yani the shortness of chain back to one of the books of hadith. And what he means here, when he simply says books of hadith, he means what they call ummahatul kutub, as if to say the mother books of hadith, meaning the fundamental ones, the main ones. He said كالصحيحين, like the two authentic books of Al-Bukhari and Muslim, was Sunan, and the four books of Sunan by the four with a capital F. Who are the four? Who can tell me all four in one answer? Don't split them up. I'll give you a 10 count. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. You said At-Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Abu Dawood, and An-Nasa'i. Correct. But I'm not asking for the books, I'm just asking for the people. So yes. At-Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Abu Dawood, and An-Nasa'i. They are the four, capital F. The authors of the Sunan, they are called Ashabul Sunan or Al-Arba'ah. So the meaning is, you have a hadith with your own chain of narration. Your hadith goes back to one of these books. Yani, let me, instead of saying two, through. Your hadith goes back through one of these books. And someone else has also that hadith with his own chain and also goes back through one of those books. But your chain is shorter than his, then yours is higher. But if his is more authentic, then his is better. And you are not understanding. How would I have my own hadith with my own chain that goes back to Malik or goes back through Sahih al Bukhari? What does this mean? Then remember, the hadith never stopped getting narrated. Meaning, weren't there hadiths being narrated before the six appeared? Al Bukhari, Muslim, and the four? The six with a capital S? Before those six appeared, and before Malik, and before Ahmed, before Abdul Razak as-San'ani, rahimahumullah ta'ala, the hadiths were being narrated. Uh, so, did they just stop being narrated? Yani, Bukhari came, wrote his book, khalas. Now, his book goes in the library. Those hadiths aren't narrated anymore. And likewise, Muslim and the four and the other Imams, they just wrote their books, now it's done? No. That's why, for example, Imam As-Suyuti, who's like 900 years after the Prophet ﷺ, he's narrating hadiths with his own chain, and in his own book, even. In his own book, even. Or Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who was what? 800 years after the Prophet ﷺ. Centuries even after Bukhari and Muslim and the others. Centuries. How do you have hadiths with their own chains? In fact, they own hadith books. Where are you going to have your own hadith books from 800 years after the Prophet ﷺ? Because the hadiths never stopped getting narrated. Yani, Al-Bukhari didn't put all the hadiths he knew in his book. He still had others too. And also the other hadith masters. They didn't put every hadith they knew in their one famous book. And they were not the only hadith scholars. Yani, this realm here is wider than someone might think. What does someone know? He knows Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, An-Nasa'i, Ibn Majah, At-Tirmidhi, or what else he might know? Let's say he knows Muwatta of Malik, he knows Musnad of Ahmad, knows Sunan of Al-Bayhaqi, also the Mustadrak of Al-Hakim, Sahih Ibn Hibban, Sahih Ibn Khuzaymah. I'm just trying to come up with some of the more famous books that are less famous than others, still very famous, but less famous than others. That someone who's, let's say, not a scholar, he would still know these books. But not just a regular layman, he won't know those books. He's a regular layman, but just maybe just was more diligent to study. He's going to know more books like the ones I told you. So where his mistake's going to be? His mistake's going to be to think that he has encompassed most of it. So, all those, I know all those books. He doesn't know how little he knows. All the books he never heard of. The books that came still centuries later. There were still books to come centuries later. One person said to me more than once, SubhanAllah, some people you need to repeat for them. He said to me, well, I never read the hadith such and such. So I said to him, well, how many hadiths you read, brother? He didn't even understand my question. He would say, I never read such a hadith. So I said, how many hadiths you read? Yani, do you reckon you are so well read? SubhanAllah. Anyway, this is a person who doesn't know Arabic, by the way. So even with that, now how much he's aware of or has access to. Mm. الرابع من أقسام العلو تقدم وفاة الراوي. The fourth type of highness is a narrator's death being prior to that of another, a narrator's death being prior to that of another. وَإِن تَسَاوَى السَّنَدَانِ, even if the two chains are themselves equal. Yani, there's two narrators. Each one has his own chain. Let's say their chains are equal. Neither is higher or lower than the other. But one of them passed away before the other. Now that's another type of ulu, another type of highness. Ulu. Here, the attribute is ulu, highness. الخامس تقدم السماع فمن سمع من الشيخ متقدما كان أعلى ممن سمع بعده. The fifth is priority, not priority, but firstness, if you want, firstness in, or priorness in hearing from the sheikh. Meaning, you have two narrators. Each one has his own chain. Each one has his own hadith with his own chain. But one of them heard from the sheikh before the other. One of them heard from the sheikh before the other. So that's another type of highness. And let me remind you too, that amongst the things that give priority to a narrator, is his tutelage under the sheikh, with the meaning of how long was he a disciple of the sheikh? How much did he accompany the sheikh? So this is a side note here. This one has priority over someone with less tutelage from the same sheikh. Here I like to use myself as an example that I heard from Sheikh Abdullah, rahimahullah. I met him, alhamdulillah. I sat in a handful of classes of his, maybe two handfuls. What's that compared to Sheikh Nabil and Sheikh Samir and others who've been with the Sheikh for decades, since they were young? Yani, like, didn't even have beard yet, or maybe their beard's just coming. Subhanallah. That gives the narrator priority. And that's one of the reasons why Sahih al-Bukhari has higher authenticity, more authenticity than Sahih Muslim. Because al-Bukhari was also picking hadiths that have narrators with stronger bond to the sheikh they're narrating from. This gives his hadiths more authenticity, and authenticity on top of authenticity. Not just has connected chain. Yes, has connected chain. But not just that, what al-Bukhari was looking for, also each one has like strong relationship with his sheikh, as opposed to a traveling scholar, for example. Someone who, let's say he's a scholar, and then he came and he sat and he learned from the sheikh and he joined the jama'ah for a while he's in town. Maybe he's in town for months. Maybe he's in town for a year or more or less. But they've been with the sheikh, yani, decades, for example. They are his ashab, although he's the sheikh. He's a sheikh, but they are his companions, though. So there's a difference here. Okay. Sheikh Al-Jabarti, he quotes another hadith terminology book. قال في طلعة الأنوار. The author of طلعة الأنوار said, أفضله الداني من النبي إذا يجي بسند قوي ومنهما لستة الكتب نمي ومنهما إلى إمام ينتمي ومنهما بقدم الموت على و- وقدم السماع أيضا ذو اعتلاء. This means that he said the best of it is the one that's close to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You know that means has fewer narrators. When it comes with a strong chain, so not absolutely, under a condition that also its chain is strong. And another type goes back to the six books. He named the six books in particular, this author. That's just an example. The six books, just an example. Six books with a capital S and a capital B. The six books. And another kind goes back to an imam by affiliation. Yantami goes back to an imam. So I think I told you. You have your own hadith with your chain goes back to Malik, for example, or goes back to some imam, goes back to Asyutli, for example, goes back to Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, for example, one of the greats. And someone else has a hadith also that goes back to that master. But yours has fewer narrators and yours is higher. But if his is more authentic, then his is better. And another kind is judged by or gauged by prior death. Which of the two narrators died first? Meaning, even if their chains were the same number of people, that's just another kind of highness. Which one died first? Which one has an earlier death? And earlier hearing also is a narration that has highness. وضده مبتدأ أي ضد السند الذي قلت رجاله وهو ما كثرت رجاله ذاك مبتدأ ثان أي ضد المذكور هو السند الذي اسم موصول في محل الرفع خبر المبتدأ الثاني قد نزل فعل ماض وفاعله ضمير يعود على الموصول والجملة صلة الموصول والجملة من المبتدأ الثاني وخبره خبر للمبتدأ الأول والرابط اسم الإشارة. Okay. Then he continues explaining. Question. You said, why is earlier death said to be that kind? I don't know. You're asking me, why is having an earlier death a kind of highness? I don't know. But what I can tell you is the scholars of hadith did not leave anything unturned. Yani, none of the scholars of any field, those Muslim scholars, they didn't leave any stone unturned. Yani, they investigated their sciences. They combed through them with very fine tooth comb. And Yani, they discovered everything and they knew how to categorize everything. It's like, to me, Yani, your question reminds me of something. What was said about Abu Bakr? Amongst what was said about Abu Bakr is that he was the only Sahabi who had Islam in his family for 4 generations. He's the only Sahabi who had Islam in his family for 4 generations, which is his father embraced Islam. That's one, and he was a Muslim. That's two, and his son was a Muslim. That's three, and his grandson was a Muslim. That's four. Uh, the only companion who had Islam in his family for 4 generations. Yani, who knows that? The scholars know that because they went through everything. Araft, they just overturned every single stone and they put every similar thing together. So, وَضِدُّهُ, and the opposite of that, the opposite of the high narration, meaning the opposite of the chain with fewer men, which would be a chain that has more men, that is the one which descended. قَدْ نَزَلَ. Now here, Sheikh Al-Jabarti has a lot of talk. He's just breaking down the grammar of the sentence. I'll skip that for now. But the alif here, here's the line of poetry. وَضِدُّهُ ذَاكَ الَّذِي قَدْ نَزَلَ. Here, this alif here at the end, that's called alif al-itlaq because the verb is really merely nazala. Nazala. He came down, he descended. Where'd the alif come from? This alif here. That alif is called alif al-itlaq. Alif al-itlaq. That means, that's the alif that's there for just keeping the beat. It's there to keep the beat. Nazala. وأقسام النازل وأقسام النازل النازل الذي هو ضد العالي خمسة أيضا. And the categories of the nazil, the descending report, that which is opposite of the high report. So the categories of the low report, if you want, which is the opposite of the high report, are 5 also. خمسة أيضا. فإن كل قسم من أقسام العلو يقابله قسم من أقسام النزول. For indeed, every category of highness is contrasted by a category of lowness. Like what I already told you, all what I told you, all the examples I gave you. And I said, this one is higher, this one is lower. So you got 5 categories of the low one too. كما قاله ابن الصلاح, like Imam Ibn al-Salah said, Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. Who's Ibn al-Salah? He's the Imam of Mustalah. Any question? When we say he was the Imam of Mustalah, doesn't mean there wasn't any scholar of Mustalah before him. But he's the one that everyone who came after him resorts to. Yani he's the sheikh. He's the sheikh for all the ones who came after him. Yani even if it's possible that some of those who came after him surpassed him, he's still the sheikh. Rahimahullah ta'ala. Inshallah, we'll see more of the significance of Ibn al-Salah in the Alfiyah, bi'ithnillah. Because the Alfiyah of Al-Iraqi is like rendering Ibn al-Salah book into verse. It's like taking the book of Ibn al-Salah and putting it into poetry form. And adding to it too. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik. أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. Yani after I took Alfiyah of Al-Iraqi, then I got a copy of Ibn al-Salah's book. It was like we took everything in there. By taking Al-Iraqi, it was like everything in Ibn al-Salah book was taken. I didn't read his book though, Ibn al-Salah. But I do have ijazah to narrate everything the Sheikh narrates. Maybe, perhaps we'll just, out of curiosity, do some comparisons to see what's going on there.